Hey guys, it's Miss Madison. We are on the home stretch, so we're going to be talking about our last and final writing assignment for the quarter. And you guys just have that choice book you're reading, and so that's it. We're gearing up. This is May 27th, and this will be due on May 10th. So we're looking at this assignment taking the next 2 weeks. So let's get started. Here is the process. So today and this week, your job is to understand how to do rhetorical analysis. So that's my job today, is to kind of go through that with you and practice it so you can see what that looks like. And then you're going to actually choose, sometime this week, you're going to read one of these and annotate them. So be thinking like which one you want to do for your own essay. And then next week, you guys will be actually drafting the 2 to 3 page analysis essay, and that's next week. So this is the process. Okay, good. So in terms of rhetorical analysis, what is rhetorical analysis? So rhetorical analysis is when you are looking closely at communication that someone made, right? And communication might be for all different kinds of purposes, for all different kinds of audiences. So as we think about rhetorical analysis, we're really just thinking about how do they use language to move people in a direction, right? So what kind of choices are they making with their language to do that? And that's rhetorical analysis. So looking at the kind of main things you want to focus on, you always want to think about what's the exigence or the context or situation at the time, right? So if you're talking in an elevator, it's very different from if you're talking in a movie theater or if you're talking like in your house, right? So the kind of talk that you have and the kind of situation at the time, what's going on historically and what's going on with the audience. What do they need and what do they expect? So you want to think about the situation. That always kind of guides what's available and what the author can and can't do. And then you want to talk about the author's purpose or intention. So that goes into your thesis statement, right? Because you're identifying up front, like, yeah, you have the context, you have the situation, here's what the author's trying to do, and then here's how they're doing it, right? So you're identifying those major appeals or strategies up front in your thesis. Just some reminders, diction is just a fancy word for word choice. So you're always looking at like what kind of choices do they make with the words that they choose. They have an effect. And then syntax is just a fancy word for sentence structures. So those things like parallel structure, repetition, do they have a lot of dependent clauses, long sentences, short sentences, that kind of stuff. These are just two basic sort of acronyms to kind of help you focus on rhetorical analysis. I like to keep at least one of these in mind when I'm doing it and make sure you're focusing on all this stuff. So pigsack is an option. Persona, like who's the speaker? What are they intending? What's the genre? Is it a letter or is it a movie? Like what's the genre? The strategies that they have and are available to them, the language choices, right? And then who's the audience and what's the context? So pigsack, if you like saying pigsack, there you go. There's also soapstone, so similar kind of stuff, just speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, strategies, and tone. So these are just acronyms to kind of help you remember, like this is what we look at for rhetorical analysis. Just so you guys know, rhetorical analysis is also the type of writing you would be seeing on the SAT essay, so it's good to practice it here. It's also the kind of essay you would see on the AP Lang test next year. When we do rhetorical analysis, I recommend taking a chronological order. So you're taking the speech and you're walking us down the path of their choices. So in the beginning, right, they have to appeal to the audience. They have to establish relationships or credibility. Like what do they do in the opening to sort of bring that audience in, right? So you want to analyze like how do they start and then how do they start to develop their point and set the audience up to receive their message. So you want to kind of walk us through chronologically, how do they start, how do they begin, and then how do they take us through all the way to the closing. So that's how I recommend organizing it, is just literally walking us through the choices that they make, kind of like down the path of their letter or their speech. You want to note their larger rhetorical moves as you go. So kind of as you're reading, being like, oh, now they're just flattering them, right? Or now they're starting off by establishing their credibility. And, you know, now they're going to use some humor, or they're switching gears into second person. They were using first person, now they're switching gears. So you're kind of noticing those kinds of big rhetorical moves as you go, noting like the function of what they're doing. Like, oh, are they trying to appeal to their sense of humor, or are they trying to appeal to make them afraid of something, right? Like, what is the function of what they're trying to do right now? And rhetorically, you guys know how to talk to people, so they're doing the same thing you would do, right? Trying to make their message heard and trying to make it palatable. right? So there's lots of choices you have in terms of that process. Once you have their larger rhetorical moves down, then you can start to look at their smaller choices. So things like metaphors, similes, rhetorical questions. You'll start to notice like, oh, the way he said this or the way she said this is really powerful, right? So you understand the larger context of what they're trying to do, but you also see that there's these smaller devices that are at play that make those language choices even more powerful. So be sure to refer to specific quotes and that helps you analyze as you go. As long as you have those larger rhetorical shifts and like guiding the essay with those bones of like what they're doing next and what they're doing next, then you can start to refer to these specific quotes and analyze the specific stuff as you go. Please don't organize your essays around like they used a metaphor, let's talk just about metaphor, right? Like that's not going to help us understand the speech as a whole. You want to think about their overall strategies, let that become the main focus with their larger rhetorical moves, and then shift as you do those larger things, you can add in the specific details, which brings us to these 30 rhetorical devices. So remember, I would review these if you just want to remember what these little devices are called. It'll help you if you're like, oh, I know that's a rhetorical question. Oh, that's parallelism, right? It just helps you talk about it. So you can review those if you'd like to know what those things are labeled. There's also the rubric here. We can review that real quick. So this is the rubric. It's actually page 2 because it's rhetorical analysis. And remember that you get a whole point for having a strong thesis. This is important not to lose this point, right? Because you want to have a strong thesis up front. It's a whole point just for having it. And for this part, you have to have two things. You want to have a purpose, like what's the author's intention, and their strategies, like how are they accomplishing it? What choices are they making that is really standing out to you? You don't have to put every single strategy they make, just do the ones that you think are most meaningful. And then you get into the development points. So these are 4 points. Notice there's 2 main parts. It's evidence. You want to actually have specific evidence. The things you're citing is meaningful and you're talking about them. And then your commentary. So the depth of your reasoning, explaining how does this evidence and how does the next part of their speech function for their purpose, right? Like what's the function of this section to help them achieve their goal? Is it, giving them compliments and flattering them to set them up so they can receive the message better? Like whatever the function is. And so then you're just explaining how those multiple choices contribute to their point, right? How do those things function for their goal? And then the last point, you can earn it in a couple different ways. One way is the style is really vivid, and you can check out the style checklist for that, like adding more dependent clauses, playing with your own style, the stuff you see in their writing, actually put it in your own writing, right? So rhetorical questions, repetition, playing with dependent clauses, vivid adjectives, that kind of stuff. The other way you can deepen this extra point is just deeper insights, right? So really exploring the complexities and tensions of the passage and understanding the function of those choices. So a depth of understanding and a depth of style is the way you get that extra point. So if you can imagine it this way, like getting 1, 2, 3, 4, that's really solid. That's like a high B, low A. Getting that extra point puts you into the A range for sure. So that's kind of how you want to look at the rubric. Okay, good. So we've talked a little bit about how you have commentary on the purpose and function of their language choices and how that has an effect on the audience. And so it's really just you illuminating this passage. Like we should have a deeper understanding of what's at work in the passage and how it functions, right? It's almost like you're a mechanic and you're like, this part does this thing, this part does this thing. You're kind of explaining how the car works. You're explaining how the speech works. There's the style checklist if you guys want to check that out just to deepen your style. I posted that here for you. You've probably seen that before. And then there's also just some old AP prompts, 2009 and 2000, like last year's prompt. And then there's student responses to these. So if you would like, you can check those out so you can see other people's rhetorical analysis and how that works. Okay, good. So let's get right into our job today, which is to analyze this particular speech. So this came out on the 2012 AP test, and students had 40 minutes to write about this particular speech. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk us through how I would analyze this so that you can see kind of the process of how you would read a little differently and kind of how you chunk it out to do the rhetorical analysis and annotate it really well. Okay, so let's get started. I always read the opening because the opening section here, let's see. Where's the opening section? So this section right here is important because it basically has all of these elements that are going to come in handy. So let's look at it. So on April 10th, 1962, as the United States was emerging from a recession, the nation's largest steel companies raised steel prices by 3.5%. President John F. Kennedy, who had repeatedly called for stable prices and wages as part of a program of national sacrifice during a period of economic distress, held a news conference on April 11th, 1962, which he opened with the following commentary regarding the hike in steel prices. Read his remarks carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze his rhetorical strategies that he uses to achieve his purpose. Support your analysis with specific references from the text. Okay, good. So this is the prompt. We can tell a lot based on the context already. We know that he's not upset about the steel companies raising their prices. You can tell the nation is in kind of a crisis, so that's the situation at the time. He's going to be talking to the American public, right, about this choice that the steel companies made to raise their prices. And so he's going to be trying to obviously alleviate their distress about it and also kind of hold the steel company accountable for their choice, right? So the country's in economic distress, everybody's suffering and sacrificing, and here we have this huge company like trying to reap profit. So you can see Kennedy trying to negotiate that, right? Like that's the situation. So let's check it out. Simultaneous and identical actions of United States Steel and other leading steel corporations increasing steel prices by some $6 a ton constitute a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. So up front, what is he doing here? We can see that he's really just setting up his thesis. He says it right up front. Like what they're doing by raising prices is totally irresponsible. So we have his thesis up front. That's a rhetorical choice. He's like, let me tell you this sucks, and I'm going to be really clear about that up front. So let's get back into the next paragraph. He says, in this serious hour in our nation's history, when we are confronted with grave crisis in Berlin and Southeast Asia, what do we notice even in the first line here? Like, in this serious hour of our nation's history. So we're really categorizing our identity with the whole nation here. And it's a serious hour, right? So he's recognizing the context of what's going on. And basically what the steel company is doing in a serious hour is very different than if you characterize it in a different way, right? So that choice is meaningful. And then he says, when we are confronted. So notice how he's using that kind of first person plural, like we, like I'm a part of the country, I'm a part of you, like the everyday kind of person. So he's using that we here to sort of build credibility and lend that relationship as if, you know, we are all in this together. He's not just some president. It's like we're all together. He's aligning himself with the people. He says this grave crisis in Berlin and Southeast Asia, when we are devoting our energies to economic recovery and stability, when we are asking reservists to leave their homes and families for months on end, and servicemen to risk their lives, and 4 were killed in the last 2 days in Vietnam, and asking union members to hold down their wage requests at a time when restraint and sacrifice are being asked of every citizen, the American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation in which a tiny handful of steel executives whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility can show such utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. So what do we notice? What stands out in this paragraph? There's probably a lot of things you're noticing, right? He has repetition, right? When we are asking this, when we are going through this. And he has multiple examples, example after example. When the reservists have to leave their homes and families. When we are devoting our energies to economic recovery, you know, he goes over and over with all these examples. And finally, he comes up to his full thought at the end, and he says, whose pursuit of private power and profit, there's a device there as well, there's some alliteration, and I think that's a powerful line, right? So he's leading up to his main point here at the end of the paragraph, and it's that they should be held accountable. Like their actions are kind of just deplorable and should be they should be held responsible. So the pursuit of private power and profit, that really highlights that point of like how awful they are, right? It just emphasizes it through the alliteration there. The way that he says that they have utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. He chose to point out each and every one of us, 185 million Americans, showing that their actions are hurting us individually. So that's another interesting choice. So he leads up with countless examples right up to his thesis at the end. Okay, good. So as you guys go through the process, you just want to read the actual speech and make note of the function, right? So he continues on. He says, if this rise in the cost of steel is imitated by the rest of the industry instead of rescinded, it would increase the cost of homes, autos, appliances, and most other items for every American family. It would increase the cost of machinery and tools to every American business and farmer. It would seriously handicap our efforts to prevent an inflationary spiral from eating up the pensions of our older citizens and our new gains in purchasing power. So here we see his same kind of process, right? You guys can see like he has multiple example after example. It would do this, it would do this, it would do this. After you offer like 10 examples of how the costs are going to affect us, it's hard to argue, right? So like it would do this, it would do this, it would do this. And at the end of it, you can't help but just agree with him. He says, it would add, Secretary McNamara informed me this morning. Notice how he's putting in this detail about where he's getting his information, kind of adding credibility to his point. An estimated $1 billion to the cost of our defenses, at a time when every dollar is needed for national security and other purposes. It would make it more difficult for American goods to compete in foreign markets, more difficult to withstand competition from foreign imports, and thus more difficult to improve our balance of payments position and stem the flow of gold. Notice how he's, again, doing the same process of these are all the impacts. It's going to hurt this. It's going to hurt this. It's going to make this more difficult, more difficult. So using repetition is a pretty powerful tool for him here. At this point, in terms of function, he's shifted from how it's going to affect the families in America to how it's going to affect foreign markets and also the defense. And then he goes on to say, and it is necessary to stem it from our national security if we're going to pay for our security commitments abroad. And it would surely handicap our efforts to induce other industries and unions to adopt responsible prices and wage policies. So he's saying like this is basically a disaster for American policy. The facts of the matter are that there is no justification for an increase in steel prices. So now he's shifting gears a little bit. Notice how he's gone through like all the problems and harms of it. Now he's shifting gears into how can we even justify it? Like if you have a justification, let me address that. Like so he's going to address the other side here. The recent settlement between the industry and the union, which does not even take place until July 1st, was widely acknowledged to be non-inflationary, and the whole purpose and effect of this administration's role, which both parties understood, was to achieve an agreement which would make unnecessary any increase in prices. So he's like, look, you guys already came to an agreement, and he's addressing the idea that, oh, we have to do it. Well, no, you don't have to do it. Steel output per man is rising so fast that labor costs per ton of steel can actually be expected to decline in the next 12 months. And in fact, the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics informed me this morning that, I quote, employment costs per unit of steel output in 1961 were essentially the same as they were in 1958. So the cost of major raw materials, steel scrap and coal, has been declining. And for an industry which is generally operating on less than 2/3 of capacity, its profit rates have been normal and can be expected to rise sharply this year in view of the reduction of the idle capacity. Their lot has been easier than the 100,000 steel workers thrown out of work in the last 3 years. The industry's cash dividends have exceeded $600 million in the last 5 years, and earnings in the first quarter of this year were estimated in the February 28th Wall Street Journal to be among the highest in history. So he's going really deep in terms of statistics here and actually offering very detailed account about how this is not necessary and they already have enough profit, and he has strong evidence for it. So he's kind of shifted into a more detailed kind of logical approach with statistics here. Then he continues on, in short, at a time when they could be exploring how more efficiency and better prices could be obtained, reducing prices in this industry in recognition of lower costs, their unusually good labor contract, their foreign competition, and their increase in production and profits, which are continuing this year, a few gigantic corporations have decided to increase prices in ruthless disregard of their public responsibilities. Notice the word choice here, gigantic corporations have decided to increase their prices in ruthless disregard. So very powerful, biting language here. It just shows them as complete villains in this whole process. After he's basically listed all the reasons why they wouldn't have to do that, and then he brings out how they did it anyway. So kind of a rhetorical choice there. The Steel Workers Union can be proud that it abided by its responsibilities in this agreement, and this government also has its responsibilities, which we intend to meet. So notice he's addressing the union here. Rhetorically, I think he wants to address all the people who have who are affected by this, and he also has to kind of like watch how he negotiates that, right? Because at the time unions were like a big deal, and he has to negotiate like how does he align himself with unions or not align himself with unions. So he's kind of paying homage to the unions without and also telling them like, hey, thanks for honoring your agreements, which is what he wants them to do. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are examining the significance of this action in a free competitive economy. So notice here, what is he doing? He's bringing in the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Defense, and talking about how all these government entities are now going to take a review of this and figure out what to do about it. He says the Department of Defense and other agencies are reviewing its impact on the policies of procurement, and I am informed that these steps are underway by those members of the Congress who plan to appropriate inquiries into these price decisions are so quickly made and reached, and what legislative safeguards may be needed to protect the public interest. So now he's going into like, okay, we're going to take action, right? And these are the things that are in the works to do that. Price and wage decisions in this country, except for very limited restrictions in the case of monopolies and national emergency strikes, ought to be free and privately made. But the American people have a right to expect in return for that freedom a higher sense of business responsibility for the welfare of their country than has been shown in the last 2 days. So here he's really trying to get everyone to kind of balance that desire for a free market with a desire to take care of the people in your country. We can see that happening today. So this isn't an issue that went away. And then he ends with, some time ago, I asked each American to consider what he would do for his country. So he's referring back to his inauguration speech, right? Like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so he's referring back to that, and he says, and I asked the steel companies. In the last 24 hours, we had their answer. So it's a definite calling out of their behavior and basically labeling it as like horrible, right? Like we got to see how they responded to this call, and he's basically calling them cowards and villains here. So it's a pretty powerful way to end it. Like we got their answer and we know where they stand. So it's a very biting criticism. Okay, good. So do you guys see how you go through this process? So basically you're looking at how each section kind of functions and how he's shifting gears and what each section is meant to do. So at some points he's appealing to us personally and making us feel like we are hurt by this. And then at other points he's appealing to more of a logical approach, like don't worry, you can address the counter argument here, right? Like with logic. So he moves through different rhetorical strategies to achieve his purpose. And then if you guys scroll down, you can actually see that's the old rubric. You can scroll past that. And there's a lot going on here. This is just the first actual sample, and it's 2A. So if you read the first one, you'll notice this is a top scoring one. Keep in mind they only had 40 minutes to write this, but it gives you an idea of how you could do a rhetorical analysis and kind of how that sounds. So I recommend reading that and just kind of checking it out. This one is, again, a little shorter than the one you guys will write. You guys will write a 2-pager. This is obviously handwritten. I think it's 2 pages handwritten. Normally you have more time. You don't have to take 40 minutes like this person did, but it does give you an idea of kind of one example of rhetorical analysis. So great. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to look at another sample essay in a second video so you guys can see like how do we do the writing process. But up next, I just want you guys to start to pick your own rhetorical analysis topic. So you guys get your own text. These are the choices. I tried to pick choices that you guys would be into. Magnus Lowell's is a satire. Edward Abbey is like a famous sort of eco-environmentalist. He is well known for his humor. Hunter S. Thompson, I think, is a legend. You guys may have heard of him. And this is a letter to a friend. And then lastly, this is Abigail Adams. And by no means, like, I don't mean to say that this is like a boring letter. It's not. It's just 1800s. I think she's, just like every other parent, giving advice to her kid and ultimately wanting her kid to grow up to be a president of the United States. So it's kind of an interesting letter for that reason. How do parents give advice? Good. And with that one, you can also see there's a student response that had top marks there as well. So if you're interested, you can check that out. So this week, really what I'm looking for you guys to do is to submit your thesis statement for whichever piece you end up doing. So I want to see that you can identify their purpose and their strategies, and that'll really start to kind of focus for your essays that you're going to write next week. All right, that's it. I miss you guys, and I'll talk to you soon.